Well, hey kids, it's Mark again. Last time I talked a little bit about how people treat each other in the uh, lightsaber hobby. This time I want to talk a little bit about fandom in general. Uh, I've been a science fiction fan my whole life, starting in the 1960s. If I had to put a finger on probably the first thing that really locked me into it was probably watching science fiction movies on TV because my parents are both science fiction fans. Uh, Star Trek was definitely one of the first things I got involved with. Star Trek had a very dedicated following even in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Uh, Probably my next serious fandom after that was Doctor Who in the mid-70s, then Star Wars when it came along. Star Wars is probably the thing that I've been most involved in. And it's funny considering how many hundreds of hours of programming there is related to Star Trek versus Star Wars, because I never got into the expanded universe stuff, all the books, actually in either of those franchises. Um, I like the 6 movies, one bad TV special, and those 2 Ewok movies. That's Star Wars canon as far as I'm concerned. I'm just not aware of what goes on in the rest of them. If you die in one of the movies, you're dead as far as I'm concerned. One thing to remember, people like to debate a lot about between Star Trek and Star Wars, and people inside Star Wars like to debate about a lot of stuff, and people inside Star Trek like to debate a lot of stuff, which series is the best, stuff like that. They can't agree on anything other than, I think, Enterprise is probably the worst. I see this debate all the time, and people have pitched Star Trek fans against Star Wars fans, and I think it's an unnecessary comparison because while they are both in the science fiction, science fantasy, speculative fiction realm, they are nothing alike. They're 2 very different approaches in that genre. Star Wars is fantasy-based, where almost nothing is technical or scientific. In 6 movies, the one jarring technical explanation that sticks out and seems to really annoy people and stuck out to me when I saw it is the midichlorians. They exist in canon, but the fact that they were explained makes them different from damn near everything else in Star Wars. They never explain, oh, a lightsaber works like this. The ray guns have sights, but you can't hit anything with them because of this. There's never any explanation about anything in those shows. Technology is essentially magical, and the magic is magical. Well, everything in Star Trek is technology. Everything has names and explanations, and whole plots twist around some of these technical aspects of the show frequently. But it's important to remember that one thing would not exist without the other. When Gene Roddenberry created Star Trek, he, as a science fiction fan, wanted to do something on television that would be a good format for a weekly show and examine some political things that were going on. You have to remember this is in the mid-1960s during the Cold War. The crew of the Enterprise, multicultural, very much embodied the libertarian conquest for the future, and the other races in the show, the Klingons, Romulans, and stuff, were often stand-ins for our Soviet counterparts, especially the Klingons in those days. The series ran 3 seasons. It was more popular after it was canceled than while it was on. And continuing efforts of a lot of people started so many things. They started what we now know as a science fiction convention. There were conventions for decades before that, but they were primarily literary. This is the first time something came together as a meeting for people with similar interest. Was some of the first Star Trek cons. I'd been attending those since the early 70s with my folks when they came around town. It's also important to realize that, like I said, the two things would not exist without the other. Here's why. George Lucas has said early on when they were talking to him about the development of Star Wars that it's something that he was inspired to do by things that he watched growing up. Old movies, serials, Flash Gordon, stuff like that, and including Star Trek. When Star Wars came out and was successful in 1977, it made science fiction films, a large science fiction film, viable in the marketplace, in the minds of a lot of people. The people with money that get movies made. And the idea of a Star Trek II had been kicking around for several years in what they call development hell as a TV series. And when Star Wars came out and was successful, hey, guess what? We're going to throw some money at it and make a movie out of it. And it was a moderately good movie, as Star Trek movies go. My phaser just went off. But it did pave the way for the future films, Wrath of Khan and all of that, and eventually the new shows, Next Generation, Voyager, Deep Space Nine, that were, pretty successful. So one thing doesn't really exist without the other at some point. Whether the chicken or the egg thing of what came first isn't important. If you were born after 1980, they both existed before you did. I'm in the fortunate position to be older than both of those franchises and to have seen them all in their original runs. So I don't really think it's anything to fight about. I hate to see things get torn apart so much. You don't see vicious arguments between people that like Farscape and the people that like Firefly, or the people that like Blake Seven and the people that like Doctor Who, stuff like that. There seems to be a lot of snob effect in Star Wars fandom and indeed in Star Trek fandom. They are the two most serious and dedicated fandoms out there. These other shows, you don't have groups of people starting their own ships and dressing up, spending thousands of dollars on costumes and things. I mean, Star Wars has always had the better toys, at least from my point of view. I've never owned a whole lot of stuff that had to do with Star Trek. I have this phaser. This is from actually the new Jar Jar Abrams movies. This was like the best Star Trek stuff that was out for a long time. The compendium. This allowed you to follow what was going on in the show. And of course, now that there's hundreds more hours of programming, they've got these Star Trek encyclopedias that are this thick, and they're required really to watch the show because the backstories become so complicated and intense. That's why the show petered out like it did. Writers could not come up with anything new. And I welcome the new movies. When I was doubtful, I saw the first one, I was okay with the new universe. And of course, then the second one came out and was basically a bad remake of Wrath of Khan, and I gave up. But that doesn't negate the hundreds of hours of stuff that came before. Star Wars, like I said, has always had better stuff. Here's the oldest Star Wars item I have. It's the portfolio of Ralph McQuarrie concept art. This came out in 1977. And here's a calendar. Ballantine Books published these. Again, this is the 1978 calendar, so it came out in 1977. That and a bootleg lightsaber is probably like the earliest stuff that I ever had for it. I never got into buying a lot of the figures and stuff. So, to me, they're two very different things that I both enjoy. Star Trek is a more thoughtful, based on sometimes on current events, even though they're older now. Meditation on life. And while Star Wars has a lot of deep thought in some things in it, it's based on a lot of old stories and things that ring in people's minds, which is why it's successful. The hero of 1,000 faces. It is more fantasy adventure. It's more Edgar Rice Burroughs than Norman Spinrad. You know, it is a fantasy world, and it does not explain itself. And on one hand, that leaves it open to your own explanation. On the other hand, that does cause some arguments every once in a while. I had an argument earlier today on the internet about clones again. But I'm going to do some more of these. I have some more thoughts on this subject. Not necessarily this subject, but subjects related to fandom. And they'll pop up from time to time when I think about them. Y'all have a great day.